So, welcome to the Lyceum and to our fall IForum Community Land Trusts Innovation for Home Ownership Access. My name is Chelsea Ross. I'm the newly appointed Executive Director here at the partnership, and I'm so pleased to have you all with us in person today. This is actually my first in-person IForum at the partnership. I joined in February 2020, and you all know what happened next. So this morning, we'll be joined by virtually by our keynote, Jenee Gaynor, followed by a short break as we welcome an exciting group of panelists to the front for a discussion. I'm supposed to have my agenda here, but I think we're out of order. Anyway, you'll just listen to the agenda. Reserve time for audience question and answer, and we'll close at 11:45. As we get started, I want to acknowledge the team here at the partnership that put today's forum. Danielle Hubley, Education and Advocacy Manager, and Alicia Gardner, our Senior Policy Analyst. Thank you also to Colleen Sharmless, our Collective Impact and Equity Director, and Emily Luck, our intern, and of course Sean Gio, our Policy Director. At the Partnership for Strong Communities, we are leaders and partners in affordable housing advocacy. We envision a Connecticut where everyone has a safe, stable home that is affordable to them in an equitable community of their choice. We are here for housing justice, equity, and access. At the partnership, we have spent 25 years working to support a shared vision for change that partners are bought into and actively working towards. We are advocates and policy experts. We serve as a trusted source of information to build public health. We are conveners. We build and leverage relationships with and between diverse and disparate partners, sectors, and impacted communities. And our guiding principle is that housing is a human right. Our mission is carried out through partnership. We facilitate, nurture, and leverage crucial relationships because we are stronger and more impactful when we are united. We work to create and support an anti-racist, inclusive culture throughout our work, internally and externally. We ground our work in facts and data that we use to dispel myths, challenge stereotypes, and fill in gaps and knowledge to drive narrative, policy, and systems change. And we prioritize housing solutions that will be affordable and sustainable in the long term. We focus on the full spectrum of housing needs and experiences of communities now and for generations to come. Lastly, we work to impact change with and in support of individuals and families across the housing stability continuum. As a result of our work, fewer families should experience being unhoused or unstably housed, living in temporary, unaffordable, or unstable housing conditions. All families should have access to non-time limited housing they can afford that is safe and healthy and in thriving neighborhoods. This includes rental and home ownership. Today we'll focus on how shared equity models, specifically community land trusts, can help promote home ownership here in Connecticut. Owning a home is one of the biggest keys to building wealth and generational wealth, yet it's become increasingly unattainable for many households, particularly younger prospective homebuyers and households of color. Only 26% of all home purchases in 2022 were made by first-time homebuyers, which is at an all-time low. Housing production has slowed overall, and new ownership housing production has shifted towards larger format single-family homes. As production has slowed and changed, the inventory of homes for sale has tightened, particularly for entry-level homes. Declining inventory has been accompanied by steep increases in home prices, especially among entry-level homes in high-cost, supply-constrained markets. The current median sale price of homes in Connecticut continues to hover around $350,000. 5 decades ago, the typical home in Connecticut cost about $25,500. That's equivalent to roughly $190,000 in today's dollars. So these dynamics have shifted the makeup of home buyers toward less diverse, older, higher income households. Nationally, the average of the first-time home buyer is 36 years old, which is at an all-time high. So Connecticut is following these trends with census data showing that over the past decade, a smaller share of working age households, 25 to 55, own a home versus renting, and this has been going in a consistent downward trend. So we know that increasing production and diversifying the housing types built can provide more opportunities for low-income and younger home buyers. And today we're going to hear from the experts on how the community land trust model works to expand homeownership. There's the agenda, sneaking out on me. All right. We'll start by welcoming Jenee Gaynor, an expert on shared equity models and community land trusts. Jenee is currently the Director of Shared Equity Housing at NeighborWorks America. In this role, she leads the Shared Equity Housing Initiative, supporting NeighborWorks network organizations explore, adopt, and scale shared equity housing models to serve their communities, such as community land trusts, deed-restricted homeownership, limited equity housing cooperatives, and resident-owned manufactured housing communities. Previously, Jenee served in a variety of roles, providing technical assistance and training at Grounded Solutions Network, supporting nonprofits and municipalities to explore shared equity affordable housing models that last for generations and support equitable, inclusive communities. Jenee's prior work included roles at Capital Impact Partners, the National Association of Regional Councils, and the Washington Area Community Investment Fund. Jenee earned a master's in Community and Economic Development from Penn State University and a BA from the George Washington University. And so I'd like to, hopefully through Zoom magic, welcome Jenee.
Good morning. Can you hear me? I hope so. Awesome. I'm so glad to be able to join you virtually this morning, and I hope you're all really enjoying that time to connect in person. I'm a little jealous I won't be able to listen in on the panel coming up after my remarks, but I'm so appreciative of the creative agenda making from the folks at the partnership to bring us all together in this hybrid format. And so as I think you know, I won't be able to take questions or see your faces. So I do hope you're not all looking down at your phones already, but I'll do my best to make this engaging from the screen. So as Chelsea so kindly introduced me, I'm Jenee Gaynor. I've been at NeighborWorks America serving as director of our Shared Equity Housing Initiative for just over 1 year. And prior to that, I spent a lot of time at Grounded Solutions Network, supporting shared equity housing programs. And to share a bit of a roadmap for the next 30 minutes or so, I'll start off with a short overview of my work at NeighborWorks America and then dig deeper into shared equity housing models in general and the community land trust model specifically. I'll close things out with a few examples and ideas that I think are key for success for a CLT. And with that, we're off. So, as many of you likely know, NeighborWorks America is a congressionally chartered and funded nonpartisan nonprofit organization. And we provide communities with affordable housing, financial counseling and coaching, training, resident engagement, and collaboration work through our network of nearly 250 member organizations in every state, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. And so NeighborWorks America's Shared Equity Housing Initiative began with a dedicated appropriation from Congress back in 2019. And as of the fiscal year 2023, we've had over $12 million to support our initiative, which has been really special and exciting. And since we knew we were stepping into a space that our network and national partners had been working in for a while, we started off with a big scan of our network organizations, as well as the national partners supporting this work. And unsurprisingly, we found that different organizations were at different stages of this work. And so we've designed our initiative to try to meet folks where they are across this continuum of capacities and interest. And so we're helping organizations explore, adopt, and scale 4 kinds of shared equity housing models. And that includes community land trusts, our focus today, as well as deed-restricted homeownership, resident-owned manufactured housing communities, or ROCs, and limited equity housing cooperatives. And so to date, we've engaged over 75 of our network organizations, and lately it feels like that number has really been growing weekly. And so again, I'm excited to share some of our learnings here. And I have just one more slide about my work right now. And I wanted to share it because there are a few resources that could be of interest to you, especially on that building awareness side. There's some cool communication tools up on our site, like a video describing shared equity housing and homeownership models, a model guide that kind of helps you compare and contrast cooperatives versus community land trusts versus deed restricted homeownership. And then on that far right side of the slide, the report Advancing the Promise of Shared Equity Housing Models. It's an outcomes report from the first 3 years of our work. And it really, I have highlighted a few of the results later in my remarks. And so again, it could be an interesting thing if you decide to dig deeper. And so to get into it, shared equity housing, I think of it as a bit of an umbrella term. It's really about models of affordable housing that are balancing the benefits of individual ownership with the community benefits of having land and housing that remains affordable over time. I think that shared equity can be a bit of a misnomer. Owners are really sharing the appreciation of their homes, not that like down payment equity that they're building. And so, as I mentioned, within NeighborWorks America, we're talking about CLTs, ROCs, deed restricted housing units, and limited equity housing cooperatives when we say shared equity models. It is a bit of an umbrella term, and so it's always helpful to unpack what someone means if you hear them saying it. So it's always good to start with this definition. And so some of the things that these models have in common include resale restrictions that are keeping homes affordable for the long term. In the case of limited equity housing cooperatives, CLTs, and deed restricted homes, homeowners are really agreeing to sell their homes at an affordable price in the future, instead of the maximum amount that they could get on the market. In ROCs, the individual home is not resale restricted, but the entire community is. So once the homeowners purchase their community and own it cooperatively, they're agreeing not to sell it for a profit. And so in shared equity housing, homeowners are also accessing the risks and rewards of homeownership. Those are really real. But in these models, they're sharing those risks and rewards with their nonprofit partner. And that partner is engaged in what we call stewardship, actively supporting homeowners through things like pre- and post-purchase housing counseling, as well as offering opportunities for homeowners to engage with each other in community, and generally serving as a partner invested in their homeowner's success, rather than kind of exclusively someone at the closing table or someone monitoring for compliance with the regulations only. So it's going beyond that and really stewarding and supporting the homeowner. And then finally, these models generally have a strong community role. Often it's baked into the model in some form of democratic governance, like the CLT model that you'll hear about later. But in all of them, there's a strong sense of community value, again, because the models aren't just about helping one homeowner, but rather about creating lasting affordability through a community asset. And so hopefully that's all resonating and making sense in terms of that umbrella term of shared equity housing. And now I'm happy to spend the rest of our time here digging deeper on the Community Land Trust or CLT model here. And so CLTs are community-controlled nonprofit organizations, and they acquire land and steward it permanently to meet community needs. And someone once told me, and I love to repeat it, that in a CLT, when you own land, it's not about the highest and best use of the land based on the market forces, right? That's what we hear people talk about in land use and zoning conversations, the highest and best use. When a CLT owns the land, it's about finding the best use that will meet community and resident needs. We're not thinking about the market, we're thinking about the community values and goals. And so we're going to be mainly focused on home ownership on community land trust land today, but it's important to note that the CLT land can really be used for a wide variety of uses that the community sees fit. That can include rental or supportive housing. It could be open space. It could be community facilities like schools, even commercial space supporting small businesses or other businesses that the community or neighborhood is lacking and wants to draw in. It's really just thinking about a different way of owning and developing community assets. And I do think it's really important to spend some time on the history of the community land trust model, because this context, I think, is really valuable. A group of civil rights activists and organizers in the South established this model in the late 1960s. They were seeking economic self-determination for Black farmers trapped in the racist sharecropping systems. And those leaders sought examples and inspiration abroad. They were learning about a variety of cooperative ownership and management structures. And then they created New Communities, Inc., with a vision for cooperatively owned and managed agricultural land that would also provide individual home ownership opportunities for the folks working and living on that farm. And so they originally purchased over 57,000 acres at the time, becoming the largest single tract of land owned by African Americans. And they really got to work turning this vision into reality. They established all of the kind of ground level work that has later been adapted into the modern community land trust model. And I like to share a little bit more about the outcomes of their work, because it didn't stop there with creating the model. In the end, they were really denied grant funding and eventually lost the land to foreclosure after a prolonged drought. They did join a lawsuit against the USDA to address the injustices they faced as Black farmers. And it eventually led to a settlement that they used to purchase the Cypress Pond plantation in 2011. And they established Resora, a retreat, conference center, and working farm that's currently in operation in Albany, Georgia. And so if you want to learn more about this incredible story and the real roots of this movement and the work, there's a film called The Arc of Justice, and it can really help you place all of this work in historical context. It helps me think of the CLT movement and CLT's work really trying to pursue racial justice, focused on cooperative work and innovation to meet community needs. And so today, there are nearly 300 community land trusts across the country. This map and the data from Grounded Solutions Network really combines community land trusts with other nonprofits managing deed-restricted homeownership programs. Basically, this map of 314 organizations all have homeownership units with lasting affordability. And so the count estimated at the end of 2022 was 15,000 of those ownership units. And then those same organizations had over 19,000 rental units with affordability that lasts. And again, that can be really important if you're facing rental affordability terms expiring after 15 or 30 years. And you'll see that there are some concentrations of CLTs across the country, and that often is because of supportive state or local policies that might be supportive of the CLT model specifically, or just lasting affordability and shared equity in general. But I hope that this map shows that the model really is present across the country. It takes different forms in different communities, but they're urban, suburban, rural, a variety of service area sizes and demographics across the country. So we've really taken and built and expanded on that model that started, in farmland in rural Georgia. And so, as I briefly described before, CLT homeownership provides access to affordable ownership, not just to one family, but to all families who are going to purchase that home in the future. And the CLT model does this by really retaining ownership of the land beneath the home and then selling the improvements or the house to the homeowner. The CLT and the homeowner, then they can sign a ground lease. It's typically a 99-year renewable lease that provides the homeowner to that right to quiet enjoyment of all the land, even though they don't own it, as well as their home that they do own and have a mortgage on. The ground lease also describes a few key agreements, especially the resale formula that the CLT and the homeowner agree upfront to use to calculate an affordable sales price whenever the homeowner decides that they're ready to sell their home. And I like to use this slide as kind of basic as it is, but I like to show a different way of visualizing the CLT homeownership. And so that steeper green line, it represents the market prices for homes, right? Chelsea said it was like what adjusted dollars 190 was the previous, like 50 years ago, the home prices, and now it's over 300, right? So that's that steep growing of the market prices. And then the orange line that's more gently sloping, it represents the increase in the average household's income, or what they can afford to pay for a home. We know income isn't the only element there, especially with interest rates going so high right now. So what we see in most markets is that gap between the cost of homes and what people can afford is increasing over time. It's getting bigger and bigger. And so as time passes, those blue arrows demonstrating that gap are getting bigger, right? And you need to offer larger and larger down payment assistance amounts in order to serve similar households. And many municipalities and nonprofits then start using a recapture model, right? You have the home buyer paying back the subsidy that they initially received so that you can hopefully subsidize another home. But because that gap grows and grows and grows, you still need to supplement that even after it's repaid and you're able to serve another household. So in the CLT, we think about it a little bit differently. The homeowner agrees that in exchange for purchasing the land at the price they can afford, somewhere on that orange line, right? They'll also sell their home at an affordable price in the future. So instead of chasing or combining subsidy to try to fill those blue arrow gaps, they're just staying on that orange line. Again, there's a lot of nuance in how individual CLTs out there will implement their resale formula, or that methodology for calculating the affordable resale price. But in trying to stay closer to that 50,000 foot level, 500,000 foot level maybe, I just think that that's a really helpful way to frame it. The CLT is creating that lasting community asset, and you're kind of removing yourself from chasing that green line of market prices, and you're agreeing to just move along what folks can actually afford. And so now I've talked a little bit about how CLT homeownership is structured, but what exactly are the benefits of CLT homeownership? I think I've led into a little bit of them, but to say first, these models make it easier for a family who wouldn't otherwise have access to homeownership to build wealth. And this comes from stable housing payments, paying down their mortgage, and sharing in the home's appreciation. CLT homeownership can also play a role in helping to close the racial wealth gap, especially when paired with other systemic changes in investments. Secondly, CLT homeownership helps housing stay affordable for future generations. These soaring prices that we've seen lately in many markets, they make it clear that we need to invest in ways that make housing affordable now and stretch that investment to protect the home as affordable in the future. That way neighborhoods can really stay vibrant and diverse. And then that really helps get to that third point, right? These models stabilize neighborhoods. They preserve access to land and housing over time, and when employed with strong resident-driven strategies, they can preserve the character of a neighborhood and allow communities to stave off gentrification and displacement. Now I'm going to get a little bit deeper on each of these benefits with some data and examples coming up. So one of the common myths about CLTs is that homeowners cannot build wealth, right? They can build wealth through CLT homeownership. They just build it mainly through those stable housing costs, paying down their mortgage, and then sharing in the appreciation of the homes. I have two slides on this one just to make sure that you would be able to see the general and specific examples. And so this table is the general example. It comes from Homekeeper. As a quick aside, the Homekeeper social impact dashboard at myhomekeeper.org. It's a great resource when you're looking into shared equity housing models and want to look at this data. You can sort by region or model. And in this case, I'm looking at all of the data across the country over all time. But it shows that, yes, while median market appreciation over this time period was $19,000, the median resale restricted appreciation is over $8,000. And so when you pair that with the mortgage paydown amounts, it shows that like people who otherwise would remain renters, unable to build this kind of wealth at all, are able to make some significant gains. In general, most studies show that around 2/3 of CLT homeowners move on to market rate homeownership when they sell their first CLT home. So it really is a growth period over time. And then this is some specific data from Champlain Housing Trust. Champlain is a NeighborWorks network organization, and they're also one of the oldest CLTs in operation today. They're located in Burlington, Vermont. And so we help them look at this evaluation data through some evaluation services, and they also included homekeeper data. And it shows that yes, homeowners who own their home for less than 4 years were on par with that like average from the nationwide data, but that homeowners stayed into their homes, who stayed in their homes for like a longer period of time, they really tend to have significant wealth building opportunities. So if people are staying in that typical 5 to 7 to 10 years, you're looking at over $20,000 of wealth building through their homeownership time. And I want to add an example here of how you can leverage that CLT wealth building, that modest CLT wealth building, with other initiatives to break down the racial wealth gap. And so Champlain Housing Trust recently launched their Homeownership Equity Program, and it's a special purpose credit program designed to support households of color buying their homes with this additional equity boost. So the program provides up to $25,000 for qualified shared equity home buyers. And so if the buyer owns and lives in their home for 3 years or more, they never have to repay that loan. So you can imagine this chart from 3 years on with that $25,000 bump for households of color specifically. And so I think this kind of thing is a really great innovation as people are looking at more special purpose credit programs to do this work. It's really layering the CLT model with that ongoing affordability with the housing equity program that's providing additional equity to really accelerate wealth building for households of color who have faced discrimination for so long. And so then that question of preserving affordability, like, does this model really work? And what does that look like in the long term? I have another chart from Homekeeper data again, and it really emphasizes on the left-hand side that if the original purchase price was on average affordable to households earning 54% of AMI, that brownish bar. So that's the initial affordability of the home. And so then 5, 10, 15 years later, when the homeowners decide that they want to sell, they're ready to move on, they need to relocate, whatever their reason is. When they go to resell, the affordability is, again, it's working for, like, as time changes, it's about 52% of AMI, the orange bar there. So that shows that, you know, these resale formulas that people are using, they really are working. They're generally not, they're not getting too much more affordable, and they're not also getting like out of reach to serve a similar household in the future. And so those dark and lighter blue bars, they show the market appraisal. Again, I think it's important to illustrate that it's not that the homes are of poor quality and not holding up over time. It's that the resale formula is really helping to preserve them as a community asset to serve households of similar means over time. And those numbers are all really important because CLTs are really partners in homeownership, right? They aren't selling a home and walking away. They're engaging in stewardship and setting homeowners up for success. And so this other image here is pulled from a study emphasizing that CLTs and shared equity housing programs are just designed to avoid cost burdening their household. That's not where the affordability is coming from either. Even when they're serving households at lower AMIs, like 50% or less. They're really doing it thoughtfully and with significant subsidy up front because they're able to serve more households over time. And so in general, the impact of developing CLT homes or rehabbing and acquiring CLT homes in a neighborhood, it can be stabilizing, right? You're providing access to homeownership to longtime residents. You're ensuring that a stock of housing can serve people at various incomes over the long term. And CLTs, it's just important, especially to look at this kind of stabilizing work when you're facing gentrification and displacement. So instead of going up and up and up with the market prices, you can go up a little bit more slowly on that orange income baseline. And so in addition to that, just kind of, that's what the model does, I wanted to share another innovative program that came from the City of Lake CLT in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so we were able to support them through our initiative with our local network organization, a major partner of theirs. But they developed the Project Sustained Legacy program in more recent years. And this program has supported several longtime homeowners experiencing crises, sometimes major home systems failures when they don't have the capital to resolve them, or maybe they're dealing with major illnesses or other huge financial tied life events like divorce and things like that. And suddenly these homeowners don't have the income that they once had, that they need to maintain tax payments, the maintenance of their homes, etc. And so instead of facing foreclosure or a sale that would really destabilizing their housing and community connections, the Project Sustain Legacy initiative offers the option to bring their homes into the community land trust. And so this is a really intensive program that requires a lot of community input and engagement, but the stories from the homeowners who have participated have been incredibly moving. And this is the kind of creativity and neighborhood stabilization that CLTs can really create. And again, they don't have, it's not just saving that one family's home, they're creating a lasting community asset going forward and stabilizing that one family. And so finally, getting to that element of community control and empowerment, that's a real benefit for the CLT. And I glossed over this a bit at the front end, but the traditional CLT has some really unique governance elements. At least 2/3 of the CLT's board is made up of residents. 1/3 are lessees living or doing business on CLT land, and then 1/3 are residents in the CLT service area. That last 1/3 is the kind of traditional stakeholders you see on nonprofit boards. And that board composition, combined with a membership structure, where the bylaws, the like kind of traditional bylaws ensure that key activities are approved by the board and all members, it really allows you to say that this is a community controlled nonprofit. And there are a lot of ways to make that happen, but it provides this major opportunity for engagement, leadership development, and true community control and visioning for what you're going to do with the land you're working to acquire. So on the right-hand side of the slide, I just think that like this ties together some of the outcomes that residents in the Champlain Housing Trust CLT program have. That green positive effects bar, some of that can be chalked up to homeownership in general, but some of that is really because you're becoming a homeowner and part of a community organization where you know that your voice matters and you have opportunities for real empowerment and control. And so now we're going to close things out with a few brief observations on things that I've seen be particularly helpful for establishing and scaling the CLT model. First, I know if you thought some of those benefits were intriguing, it's like, how do you actually know if the time is right to consider a CLT? And so I wanted to share some of the common themes we hear when groups really do seem ready to complete those feasibility studies, adopt these models, et cetera. And so one of the key factors is that you're really starting to feel that you need to help more than one household with the amount of subsidies it takes to make a home affordable. Maybe you've tried that recapture model, but it's just not enough, or like you're just facing this resource constrained environment. And in order to keep doing homeownership, because doing homeownership is an important value, you realize that you need to serve more people with that subsidy investment. Another theme that folks seem to see is like in their service area, they're seeing a lot of displacement or the potential for displacement. And they really want to make sure that households of modest means can stay and have access to homeownership opportunities in their neighborhood and community. And then finally, some groups are really pursuing this work because they believe in that resident control of land and housing opportunities. And basically it just feels right to engage in the community land trust model. And so in terms of establishing CLT supports, there's really a lot to unpack here. But as you're thinking about CLTs or other shared equity models, I think it's really important to consider how they'll be supported from a state and local level. And I just want to give you the short list of some of these elements. For funding and financing programs, you'll want to be looking at housing trust funds, ensuring that CLTs might be named or prioritized as eligible recipients, that you're including CLTs or lasting affordability or shared equity housing in like your statewide planning documents. Often there are opportunities to award points or preferences, right? And there's a strong argument there sometimes because you're getting points or preference for that subsidy that's going to serve multiple households over time instead of just one. And then additionally, in that kind of funding and financing, making sure that mortgage products are available and compatible with your selected legal mechanisms. And so there's been a lot of work over time to standardize the model ground lease, and there's a relatively new model deed restriction that all work well in the secondary market. And so there's just been a lot of work to do this, and it's an important thing to do upfront, get those mortgage lender partners on board ahead of time. And so then one specific way to access subsidy or make the numbers work for CLT projects is really to look at access to publicly controlled land, right? That might mean seeking land banking or land disposition policies that would prioritize or encourage CLT homeownership or housing as a qualified end use. And that could make a lot of sense because, right, it's transitioning from an existing community asset of the land to another needed community asset, affordable housing that's going to serve generations. And so a lot of communities leverage new development as well to kind of generate units in the CLT model. And that might be through negotiated agreements with developers who are providing a certain amount of affordable homes in any new planned unit development, or a more formal inclusionary zoning policies. When nonprofits or CLTs help those developers comply, it kind of works out for everyone. The developer isn't doing income qualification or something that they really don't know or want to engage in. And then the CLTs are really stewarding those homes and creating, again, lasting community assets. Property taxation can be a really big issue and something to always look at early, especially if you've got higher taxes. In many localities, the taxing entities agree to tax homeowners based on their resale restricted value or some kind of approximation of that. And that really eases homeowner tax bills, and it's much more equitable than those homeowners paying tax on a market value they'll never realize. So again, it's not no taxes, but it is equitable taxation based on the resale value of those homes. And then finally, just working in coalition is key, both in terms of engaging for broader state and regional roles, and just making sure that thoughtful program design, as you might establish a CLT, it's fitting in, it's filling gaps in the housing needs and supports within the CLT service area. You're leveraging and aligning with existing programs. And since you're already here having these conversations and doing this work, I can imagine that you all are going to be well positioned for that element of consideration. And then finally, if you've decided that the time is right, you've got some supports in place, I wanted to highlight some of the ways we've seen successful CLTs really plan for success. And first, it's just knowing that that legal agreement alone is not going to guarantee ongoing affordability. I think CLTs are awesome, but the model alone is not magic for preserving homeownership. It takes staff time to plan for that ongoing monitoring and stewardship support for your homeowners. So you want to know that from the start, plan for it, execute those plans. And similarly, pre and post-purchase housing counseling and education for homeowners is often a given, but you'll also want to be doing that similar ongoing education work with partners as well. So that's the lenders, appraisers, real estate agents, everyone in your housing ecosystem you might interact with. And again, starting that kind of work sooner rather than later is even better. And so again, these statewide conversations, things like this are exactly the right kind of thing to be doing if you're considering these models. And that's finally, just being strategic is the last element that I think is important. And again, thinking about how you and your role could fit into this work, whether you're a funder, a lender, a housing counselor, an advocate, whatever is right for you and your work, could be really important. They're all important along the way. So I just wanted to add those thoughts. And so with that, I'm really happy to turn things back over to Chelsea and the upcoming panel of practitioners, doing this great work, exploring and implementing the CLT model on the ground. Please don't hesitate to dig in on our website for those resources that I mentioned early on, or to reach out to me. Again, I loved being here. I hate not knowing if anyone had any questions, so please don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything I could clarify. And thanks again. Thank you, Chelsea, for this opportunity to participate in the IForum today.
No, I went to college there.
Folks, come on back to the conversation. I'd like to welcome our panel of practitioners to the front of the room. And I'm going to have each of you introduce yourself as I pitch you sort of your first question. And I'm going to start with Myrna. Will you take a moment to introduce yourself and share what brought you to the work that you do, Myrna?
Good morning, Myrna Martinez. I am the Executive Director of the Southeastern Connecticut Community Land Trust. What brought me to the work is funny. I'm a teacher by training. And this morning I was talking to someone during the pre-coffee hour and just talking about the overlaps that we can all, that we all know about in our society, and therefore how our works connect. But in particular, it made me think of, and I didn't end up telling him the story, but it made me think of one story. Do I have time for one story? Okay. So I was teaching in New London, and I had a self-contained classroom of 13 kids, but they were kids with some really challenging backgrounds. They had stories. They had reasons to go home and cry to my husband. And it was pre myself having kids, and I had, in a sense, all the time in the world to dedicate to my students. And I was going to change their lives, right? So I was taking them to galleries and to performances, and I'd tell them continually, like, the world is yours. Like, what do you want to do? Of course you can, so and so, and of course you can, of course you can. And we had developed good classroom rapport. They had their classroom jobs. They were self-sufficient as a group, and they were great. But one day, and I've seen this kid many times since, and I've asked his permission to tell his story, including his name. So I'm a tall person, but he was even a taller 8th grade young man with a 6-year-old face, as many of them have. And I'm giving him one of my regular Jose Roberto Rojas, of course you can type of a thing. And he looks down at me and he says, and I'm a 29-year-old teacher at the time, and he says, kind of like he's letting me down on this news, he says, "Miss, you can't just get out of the ghetto." That's what he said to me. And I understood him to understand better than I do that there are these systems in place. There are all of these different systems that perpetuate their circumstances. And so I'm a teacher. I'm definitely not an expert, as you said earlier, in this area. I am a practitioner, I could say, but I'm definitely not an expert. I'm a teacher, and I'm working on one of those other systems.
And you and I, in the beginning, were talking about nobody's just anything, right? And so both can be true. You're a teacher and a practitioner and an expert. Thank you for sharing that story. Patrick, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work at the North Hartford Partnership?
Hey everyone, Patrick McKenna, Interim Executive Director at the North Hartford Partnership. Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And I'm happy to share a little bit about what I'm learning about this area. So North Hartford Partnership focuses in North Hartford. Our work is exclusively there. We came to the neighborhood at the invitation of the community to try and reimagine a former gold leaf manufacturing facility, the Swift factory. And you know, we worked with the community and to refurbish that building, to try and bring jobs and economic development to the community. And we started construction in 2018, and we opened our doors in 2020. And we have a series of kitchens and offices and a school, and Cracker opening up a daycare facility there at the minute. And you know, but our work, as I say, has been focused in the community. And you know, we heard from the community that they were concerned about kind of jobs and economic opportunity, and that's what kind of drove the work at the Swift factory. But you know, we're also kind of acutely aware of the housing conditions in the neighborhood that surround Swift. And so we looked at ways to try and improve housing stability. And so we created a community land trust in 2018, and that was just while we were starting construction on the factory building. So while it was registered with the state of Connecticut, we didn't actively do much work with it until a couple of years ago. During that time, we talked with the community, and we kind of learned a little bit more about these models. And do you want me to kind of keep going and talk about, or are you going to ask me a
I think I'm
question
going to ask
later?
you some queued up questions.
So I'll save the rest for later. But that's kind of a little bit. You know, we changed our name to the North Hartford Community Land Trust. We were originally called the North Hartford Community Land Trust, but we recently just changed our name to the North Hartford Housing Trust, and I'll tell you a little bit about why later. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, Kylie, you're no stranger to the partnership. Will you talk a little bit about where you are now and how you work with the CLT model?
Sure. Can you all hear me? Okay. So as Chelsea noted, I'm the former executive director here at the partnership. Prior to that, I worked with the city of Hartford, heading up their development office. And before that, aside from working for the federal government, some other components of my life, I worked as a tax credit attorney in the affordable housing and historic tax credit space. So my new role, I'm the CEO of Housing Development Fund. Housing Development Fund is a CDFI, for those of you who are familiar. Here in the Hartford area, Hartford Community Loan Fund and Capital for Change are two local CDFIs. And Housing Development Fund has focused most of its efforts down in the Stamford area, although we do sort of a large bucket of work, a part of which is homeownership support. So we do homeownership counseling and a whole host of down payment assistance programs for folks at or below 80% of AMI, although most are below 60%. We also have a BIPOC equity fund similar to the one that Jenny talked about today. So we work with folks on buying homes through the private market. We also have a commercial lending pool that lends to small multifamily developers who develop a portion or all of units within small multifamily property as affordable. And then perhaps most importantly for this, prior to my arrival at HDF, the prior CEO, Joan Cardy, who many of you may know, developed a 23-unit condo building, which is all affordable, and began with the intention of it being a CLT, a community land trust, but it ended up being in sort of what we call like a straight condo, affordable condo homeownership with deed restrictions on it, so more of a shared equity than a land trust model. And I'll talk more about the reasons for why that switch was made and sort of the benefits and the upsides and downsides of different types of financing models for homeownership in that type of construct.
Thanks, Kylie. All right. And Terry,
Hey.
can you talk about your current role and how you've interacted with the CLT model throughout your career?
I can, and it's so good to be here. I have the former executive director to my left and the current executive director to my right, and guess what? I'm a board member, so this is awesome. This is awesome. So I started in. Let me back up. Terry Floyd with Wells Fargo. I'm on the philanthropy and community impact team. I cover all of New England, but I live right here in Connecticut. So Connecticut is my home, and I've spent a lot of years working right here in Hartford I actually worked with that young lady for a number of years right here in the city of Hartford. And coincidentally, loved Jenee's presentation. And I started my community development career here in Hartford, again, working with this nice young lady at a place that's not in business anymore, but we were around for a long time, Co-Opportunity. And we did housing cooperatives. We did limited equity co-ops that were here in Hartford and all around the state. So spent a lot of time in that space. Now I work for Wells Fargo on the philanthropy team, and we're trying to figure out ways to support homeownership, community development, and one of the models clearly is shared equity, community land trust. I'm happy to say that Patrick and I were able to work together a few years ago, and we were just talking about it, and it was, and I'll talk more about it a little bit later. I'll be very transparent, and he knows this. It was a challenge to figure out how we could make this work. It was very difficult to figure out how I could bring Wells Fargo resources into this model. And I'm happy to say we were able to do it, and I hear they're doing great things, and we're actually going to get together again to try to figure out if there's more that we can do. So looking forward to talking about that, and I want to learn more because I really want to see if we can be more involved, and I want to bring some of my, I know C4C is here and HDF is here, but I want to bring more banking partners into this room, into this conversation. Jenee said one of the first things she said was funding support, right? Well, we need, Wells Fargo's happy to be here, but we need everybody in the room that has available resources to try to really make this thing happen. I'm happy to help make that happen as well.
Thanks so much, Terry. So let's start with, you alluded to challenges, and I think everybody here might be able to speak to those quite easily. Let's start with benefits. Jenee talked about some of the key benefits of increasing access, building wealth, stabilizing neighborhoods. Any other benefits that you've seen directly through your work that you want to emphasize or uplift? Anyone?
Oh, sure. I think one of them is like when we talk about the partnership of the land lease and the homeowner, that it's the community piece of it. There's a couple of people that I've spoken to. I mean, one having a single parent and knowing that, like, I always say for myself, for instance, I bought a traditional house with my husband 21 years ago, and I always think, like, and he does construction type of work, and I always think of like, oh my God, if it wasn't for Jesse, I don't know if I would want to own a home. I don't know how I would take care of everything. I'm one of those people who can't name those big appliance things in my basement. You know, I'm just really ignorant about the working pieces in my house. And so in a community land trust, having that staff and membership team to share resources, and that this is the land piece, is that it's an hour. Jenee said housing ecosystem, and I love that resonates to me as one of the reasons why I spoke to a woman who recently, about a year ago, lost her husband, and the house was originally in his name, and she spoke to me. I was just telling her about the model, and she said, oh my God, she said, I didn't get it before. She's like, but I would have loved to have been working with the Community Land Trust after having gone through all of this, because I needed so much help in navigating. And so I'd say that community, that housing ecosystem, she might have meant it a little bit differently, but in the way of membership, I'd say that's a huge benefit.
I can relate to, because my husband's a carpenter, and I always say that's not my department. Any other benefits folks want to lift up?
I think I'll just add, that as we know, Connecticut is a diverse state, and the communities in it are very diverse, and so what are the benefits for a community in Fairfield County, where there's major affordability issues, are very different from the benefits in communities like North Hartford or some of our urban centers, and so I think there's a wide variety of benefits to all of these models, and you know, they're not the same depending on the community. And so I think that's really important to know the community that you're working with and kind of what they need, and listen to that, you know, and be able to adapt and change to reflect those needs.
It's a great transition. Kylie, I'm wondering if you can talk about, Jenny talked about the timing, right? And you started talking about the condo development that HDF did. Can you talk about when you believe the CLT model is best, and when, you know, it's the most appropriate toolkit, and when is it less helpful and needs to be adapted?
So I think one of the things to remember when we're looking at housing, whether it's addressing housing quality issues, whether it's trying to create wealth building opportunities, whether it's just trying to finance more affordable rental, is that there's a host of different affordable housing financing programs that exist. And none of them by themselves are a panacea. They all come with pros and cons. And as Chelsea noted, and Patrick alluded to, I think sometimes different models work better than others, but there's no model that really works for all the different types of things that we're trying to do. And anytime you pick a financing model, it's going to have some downsides and it's going to have some upsides. So I think as you're addressing whatever the housing need is in a community, it's inherently important that you figure out what needs to be built and then find the right financing product to sort of match that housing product, if you will. And that's not always easy to do, and it's sometimes difficult to access those financing sources. I think in the instance, or Patrick just noted, sort of right, the needs in Fairfield County may be different than they are in Hartford, and having worked now in both areas, I can say that that's certainly true. And in Hartford proper, for example, housing quality is one of the biggest issues. And as Patrick and I have talked about very recently, there's not good tools to deal with housing quality that don't come with deed restrictions, which we don't necessarily need in Hartford, particularly in certain neighborhoods where those rents are the same as affordable rents, right? And where long-term deed restrictions can create other challenges for economic development. In the case of the land trust that Housing Development Fund started, it started out as a land trust model, in part because Joan had seen the Champlain Housing Trust model and thought, hey, this could be a financing stream, right? It is a financing tool using a land trust because you're creating a model where another entity owns the land. So you're sort of hold that land, and that equity that's held in the land is a way to finance the project. So in the case of the land trust that HDF started, it started out with the idea that there would be a land trust board. That board was created with bylaws that would own the underlying land, and then this condo development would be built on top of that land, and the residents would own the units, as it were. In the city of Stamford, there is an inclusionary zoning statute, so that means that there is a requirement that developers building more than a certain number of units have to make some affordable or pay into a trust fund. That trust fund is used to build projects like this one. So they knew that this project was going to come with its own deed restrictions. So more like a shared equity model, as Jenny described. Owners were going to buy into this model and buy a unit that ultimately they would be able to sell. But as you saw with that graph, with those two lines, right, there's a limited amount of equity that the owners are going to get back at the end of the day, because they have to sell it to another buyer at or below 80% AMI in this case, right? And so by having a land trust financing a portion of the land, that means there's even sort of less equity, because now you have underlying land being owned by another entity, and you're capping the amount of equity that the owner can get when they go to sell the unit. So in the end, the Housing Development Fund was able to get some additional grant financing that they weren't anticipating, and they used that to basically plug the financing gap that's created when you're trying to build homeownership, where the units cost $500,000 to build and you're going to sell them for $300,000. Someone has to fund that $200,000. So they were able to use grant funding to do that, so that now the only equity cap is that long-term deed restriction that's in place with the city of Stamford. And there were other reasons that that model was selected. Sometimes it's difficult to work with banks in selling land trust units. There are ways around that by partnering with banks, especially in your initial sale, but on the resale, sometimes it creates challenges for owners to sell to other buyers because the bank doesn't really understand the land trust model, and there has to be some working around that. Some banks don't want to work with a land trust model and create a mortgage for that product. So there's some other, as well as legal bells and whistles, that just create some externalities that create longer term challenges. And again, I don't think any of those are insurmountable or should stop someone from pursuing a land trust, but it's really just about, at the end of the day, looking at the different financing streams, what's going to create maybe the most equity for your buyers, if that's the goal, especially when we're talking about building to help reduce or ameliorate the racial wealth gap that we know exists today.
Thanks, Kylie. And I think it was helpful, that chart that Jenny showed too, of the other ways that people build equity in community land trust models. And that's dependent too on what market people are living in and all of those things. Patrick, how about North Hartford Partnership? How do you utilize the CLT? How did you pivot? Talk to us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned kind of before, we wanted to address some of the housing conditions in North Hartford. Callie mentioned, the quality housing is an issue. More recently, a major issue that's facing the community is kind of who owns the properties. A lot of out-of-state investors kind of purchasing properties, and maybe not thinking about them as ways of strengthening the community. But when we started the community land trust, it was thought that was going to be the best way to address the housing stability and housing quality issues in the community. North Hartford has vast majority of units are in multifamily buildings. I think there's about 90% of the units are in multifamily buildings. So that could be a 2-family building, or a lot of 3-family buildings, 6 families or more. There is a need for home ownership there, but with the vast majority of units in multifamily buildings and the vast majority of residents in the neighborhood renting, we felt that we could have the biggest impact if we try to tackle the issues around kind of affordable rents, housing quality, and local ownership, and so we decided initially to focus on rental accommodation. So we had and I just had a conversation about this morning. We had this organization called the North Hartford Community Land Trust, but a decision was made that the community's needs are more to improve quality, affordable rental accommodation, and as we talk about our work, people are saying, well, why are you called a land trust if you're not doing home ownership? And our thinking was that home ownership is still on the table, but that might be something that we do kind of at a later date. Initially we're going to focus on rental accommodation, and those conversations just kept happening. We'd our first 5 minutes of any meeting somebody would be explaining, well, we're called a community land trust, but we're actually doing rental accommodation initially. The other thing that got in the way is that Hartford started the land bank, which was a great initiative to try and kind of move some of the vacant and blighted properties that are city owned into hands of developers to improve the communities. And so after we finished explaining why we were called a community land trust, and we were focusing on rental accommodation, we then had to explain the difference between a community land trust and a land bank. And so what's a land bank and what's a land trust? And so we kind of were looking around and trying to figure out, and as Jenny mentioned as well, the Champlain, the one of the kind of most famous land trusts in in the country. Started out as the Champlain Community Land Trust, but has since changed its name to the Champlain Housing Trust, because that was kind of a broader term for the work that they were doing. And so we decided that we would just copy them, and we're in the process now of changing our name to the North Hartford Housing Trust, because we feel that's a little bit more honest to what we're doing. We don't have to have that conversations about why we're calling ourselves a land trust, but not doing home ownership. But we kind of wanted to, there are a number of things that we wanted to keep from that model. A community land trust, as Jenny mentioned, is made up of members, and then the members elect the board. By going to calling ourselves a community land trust, we kind of got away from the membership model, and we have a traditional kind of nonprofit board. But we wanted to kind of adopt the principles that Jenny mentioned of how those are made up. And so a third of our board members are community stakeholders, a third of our members are residents of our properties, and then a third are from our kind of parent organization, North Hartford Partnership. So we still tried to allow our residents to have a say in the governance and organization of the entity that owns the property that they have. And so kind of staying true to that idea of a third, kind of making up the kind of governance. And I think, as Kylie mentioned as well, in North Hartford, about 40% of the units in North Hartford are deed restricted, and so, when we purchase a property, we're choosing kind of not to do deed restrictions on those kind of voluntarily, because again, that's not the greatest need in the community. The greatest need in the community, we felt, was housing stability, housing quality, and local ownership. And so, when a property goes on the market, as opposed to a New York or New Jersey investor buying the property, we're trying to have kind of the North Hartford Housing Trust, a local nonprofit with residents on the board, as an entity that could purchase that property and maintain its affordability and quality in the community.
Thanks, Patrick. So, interestingly, both Kylie and Patrick, you were talking about community needs and what the community needs and how each of you pivoted based on community needs. And Jenny talked about community control. Myrna, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, how does the Southeastern Community Land Trust meet the existing needs of the community, and what does it look like with community relationships to know and engage in what the needs of the community are?
So I don't know how standard this is or not. I've been with the Community Land Trust since February, but we function in chapters, and so the organization has a larger name of Southeastern Connecticut Community Land Trust for the potential of growth and being able to extend into other communities. But where we have our most developed community is in New London, meaning that's where we have a developed chapter. And so that's where I live as well. So it was easy for me to, as an already engaged community member, to step in and understand what the community is. But we have a chapter leader, and we have our members of the chapter who are going to do a lot of the stating and gathering of what it is that they want to see in our community. What are the priorities of the types of housing that are going to take place there? In Salem, Salem, Connecticut, we don't have a chapter, but there have been people a group, I don't know, it's not a formal chapter yet, and we just bought a farm there. We just closed, I think, a week ago on a farm there. So the needs there are going to be, it's a very different community. Ours is it's called a city, but it's 27,000 people. It's to me, it's first time country living, but it's a city in Connecticut. And Salem it's a much more rural community. And so the needs of, it's interesting for me coming from New London and prior to that from a city, New York City, looking at Salem. I mean, first of all, it is a farm, but how is the community going to interact with this new community place in a sense, you know? So I guess that's how it's driven.
Thanks, Myrna. Terry, you know, Kylie said one of the barriers is getting banks on board, right? So can you talk about how banks and mortgage lenders and CLTs work together and where maybe they can work together better?
Yeah, and you know, she's right. As a how many years now? I don't even remember how many years I've been in banking, but as a longtime banker, you know, it's very simple when you have a property that's on 123 Example Street and a buyer goes in and makes an offer and it's accepted and they go to their local loan officer and get pre-qualified and get pre-approved and they've got a 720 credit score and they've got, you know, maybe 3%, 5% down for one of the first-time homebuyer programs, can go through a CHFA or what have you. Those are generally fairly easy. It becomes very difficult when you have an affordable model that says we're going to target 80% of the area median income and below, right? So now there's less income coming in. So what's making up that gap? Well, the CLT model can, right? So the housing price the land is calculated off of the housing price, trying to make it more affordable. So then your lender says, great. So how do I provide a document that secures my interest if you're telling me that the land isn't part of the deal? And so that's been the ongoing challenge for as long as I've been in the business and probably longer than I've been in the business. So every lender works differently, whether it's a bank, whether it's a mortgage company, they all work differently. So here's how I would suggest you handle that. Your legal documents are going to be critical early on. Those deed restrictions are going to be critical. If you can get a CHFA or a Fannie Mae or a Freddie Mac to agree that we're going to allow you to use this mortgage product for this development, then the lender has an opportunity to say, oh, this is great. CHFA is going to take that risk. We're a CHFA lender. Beautiful. Now we don't have to take all of the risk. CHFA is going to take the risk, or Fannie or Freddie is going to take the risk. So that's one way, and that's probably the quickest way to kind of get to the end result. The other way would be is to contact your local lending institution, contact your local bank. You know, there's me you can talk to for Wells Fargo, and there's several people like me that are out there. Glenn Davis comes to mind at Liberty. Carol Heller, been around forever with Bank of America, and I say that affectionately because she's great. Lily Lopez at Citi. Some of the things that we do out in the community is just that. So you've got a project, you want to make sure that you can get financing, you want to make sure that your borrowers can get approved for loans. Okay, share with me your documents. I'll share them with my back room, right? That's what we call it, our underwriting department, and let's see if we can get approved. And do several. Don't just pick one and say, hey guys, we'll give you all the loans. Nobody wants that. I'm just being very, very honest with you. Anybody who knows me knows I'm gonna be very honest. There's not a lender out there that's gonna say, I want all the loans, because that means they're taking all the risk. Yeah. And they're not gonna take all the risk. But if you say, I've got a CLT, and it's going to be a homeownership development, and there's going to be 20 mortgages on there, and let me go and try to get 5 or 6 lenders, now you're in business. So there you go.
All right. For anyone, you know, Patrick, you talked about the Hartford Land Bank. And on your fact sheet, you have sort of the difference between land banks, land trusts. What ideas do folks have about how CLTs can partner with or leverage sort of existing housing policies and programs like land banks, conservation land trusts, or others?
Yeah, I guess I'll start. You know, when we had to answer that question, what's the difference between a land trust and a land bank? And I wish I had this sheet at the time. You know, as I mentioned, you know, the land bank acquires the properties from the city, but their intention is not necessarily to hold that property, is to maybe clean it up if there are you know, tax or environmental issues with it. and then kind of turn around and make those properties available to developers. And each land bank will have different criteria for kind of what they're trying to do. In Hartford, you know, they've been really intentional about trying to make those properties available to local developers. You know, in Hartford, they've done a great job by kind of identifying the fact that there wasn't the number of kind of local minority developers that they felt was going to create an active market, and so they started a training program, and I know we have at least one in the room who kind of went through that program, and you know, to make sure that kind of local developers you know, build capacity and understand and have the ability and to be successful to bid on and acquire these properties. The land bank, you know, puts out opens up an RFP for a particular property, accepts bids for that property, and you know, and one of the things that they weigh as well as the price is, you know, what's the developer's intention with this property? Is it going to be home ownership? Is it going to be rental? You know, and who is that developer? You know, are they kind of a local organization? Are they trusted? Are they known? So that you know, they're going to do what they say they're going to do. And they, you know, so we're a community land trust or a housing trust comes into that. You know, they could be one of the developers who submits a proposal for that property. Land bank receives a property from the city, does what it needs to do to make it available, puts out a request for proposal. A number of developers submit a proposal to the land bank, and a CLT or a non-profit organization, maybe one of the developers who submits a proposal, you know, to the land bank. And so ideally, you know, they work seamlessly together. The land bank is making property available, and the land trust is then acquiring that property. And as Jenny talked about, you know, the idea for the land trust is to hold that property. Land bank wants to kind of move that property on. The land trust wants to hold that property and maintain its affordability for, you know, 99-year lease.
I have a question as the novice here. One, I guess it's just a comment, is that I don't hear, I'm circling back to the finance piece, is like one having to do with the finance. I don't hear people talk about, yes, there's the initial land price, and that's how, but then the interest going on and how the savings that is, because if we're looking at, you know, your profit, you also have to look at your expenditures, you know, and it just feels like that's something that's missing from the equation. But I guess it's not a really direct question. It's just a thing to put on the table, and like that I'd like to hear more about. And so that's one. And the other one is, I had these two women in the office. We have a community organizer and myself, and but the two women were Spanish dominant speakers, and so I was attending them. They were both from Dominican Republic, and they were looking separately. They weren't together. One of them, as I went through my slides and told them the story, was really skeptical, and the other one wasn't. And the one that was really skeptical is under the really typical, well, what do you mean I won't own the land? Like, how does that make sense? You know, like, what's a house sitting on if it's not on the land? And the other woman said, she said to the other woman, she said, you know what we're not getting is that in our country, she said, when you buy a house and you're finished paying for the house, it's just yours, and you don't ask anyone for permission for anything, and you don't pay anything for it. And she's like, in this country, you're gonna ask permission for what you're going to build. You know, you're gonna go get your permits and stuff, and then you're always gonna pay your taxes. And that to me was really striking to hear that conversation, because it made me feel like, yeah, what's the difference? What's the difference between that and my house, in a sense? Like, yes, there's a resale formula, but generally during the ownership period, like I I think I get stuck on the other like end of not understanding from the lending perspective what the difference is. I mean, we're really fortunate in New London to work with a lender who gets it and is, you know, is good with it all. But I guess just wanting to expand on that and hear that.
Yeah, I can try. So I think from a lending perspective, when we do a normal fee simple transaction, it is for the entire parcel. It is the land, it is the house, it is anything on that parcel. If you go down to the city hall and you get your survey, that whole, we are securing everything, right? When you bring in the land trust model, so now the land, right, 99-year ground lease, there are rules, there are restrictions, there are things that come along with that not every lender is gonna wanna agree with. And so, and you got a lender, which is great that you have a lender that is okay with that. I worked for a lender prior to Wells Fargo, People's United, and we did some very creative affordable housing deals during my time there. Wells Fargo being a much larger bank and having to be very careful about what we do from state to state, it's more difficult for me in Connecticut to say, hey, housing group, here's something I want to do in Hartford. And so Wells Fargo is saying, okay, well, if I do this for you in Hartford and then somebody in Sacramento or somebody in Boise, Idaho comes, I've got to give them the same consideration. And so, not saying that Wells won't do it, but it's a much bigger ask for me from a much larger bank. So I guess my second recommendation would be to start with your local banks. And hey guys, I'm here for a reason, right? I'm here to help. So I'm not saying don't approach me. I'll talk to anybody. If you know me, you know I'm not afraid. I'll talk to anybody and I'll go to my people and see what we can do. But I've learned, coming from People's United, which obviously is no longer in business, but I was there for 9 years, the climb to get senior management at People's to say, this is a risk, because all lending is a risk, all of it. But this is a risk we want to take. And this is also worth CRA, right? Because there's a CRA benefit here too for all regulated financial institutions. So this is worth the CRA benefit to take this risk. I believe a local bank or a regional bank is going to be a little more apt to do that than a national bank. And again, I don't want to speak for my colleagues. It's just from being in this business for a long time. That's what I've seen. But I don't want to discourage anybody from not approaching. Especially if you have a good relationship. And especially if there's a bank that has invested in you previously in a different project or a different program, and it worked out really well. And so now you got a track record to go back and say, okay, we want to try this out. What do you think? So did that answer your question?
Kylie, why don't you have a comment? And then I do see a couple hands starting to go up, and in interest of time, we're going to turn it to you all as experts for some questions and comments. We'll have about 10 minutes for that before we close. And then everyone here, generally, we mingle. We're minglers and talkers, so you can still grab for questions. Go ahead, Kylie.
Sure. One of the things I think is interesting to keep in mind with banking and financing the actual units and finding lenders that are willing to do the risk is, one, the more CLTs you are and the more normalized the model becomes, maybe the more banks you have come to the table. But I think in the case of Housing Development Fund, one of the things that was a consideration was sort of the long-term resale for the unit. So I think it's easier if you are a housing development fund or a land trust and you're developing a project to identify a couple lenders that are going to come in and help finance mortgages, in this case for a multi-unit condo building, say work with those partners and get them comfortable with the CLT model and get them to provide those first mortgages. I think it's another thing when individual buyers go to sell those condo units 5, 7, 10, 15 years down the line to a single buyer who's going to come to the table pre-approved by a bank or who wants to work with a particular bank and then is going to get stuck with trying to, on their own, convince that bank to finance this individual unit. That's where the CLT, the underlying CLT entity, can come in and be helpful. But that underlying CLT entity requires ongoing maintenance and insurance and other costs too. So as long as that model is strong and that CLT is there and it's being financed appropriately, they can assist with those transactions. But I think that's another concern, is what are we making sure that we're setting the buyers up for success, not just as buyers now, but as future sellers, to ensure that they're going to be able to get the equity that we're trying to create for them, and to do so in a way that doesn't have a bunch of bumps and hurdles in it. And finding a willing lender for an individual CLT unit down the line can be one of those challenges that will be important to solve for.
Excellent.
Hi, I'm Maisa Tisdale. I'm from Bridgeport. I have two questions. Why is lending to a CLT considered more risky than, say, lending for a condo or a co-op? I mean, they don't own the land either.
Well, I didn't say it was more risky than that. They're all considered, co-ops are generally, unless you go to New York, those are market rate, but co-ops in Connecticut generally are affordable. I don't know if, I'm trying to think, and I did a lot in that space, and I don't know of any market rate housing cooperatives in Connecticut. Condos are a little bit different. You do have a condo association that you have to take into consideration, but they're more similar to your normal fee simple, single family home than co-ops or than the CLT model.
Okay, so if someone funds co-ops, they might be a good place to go to look for. Okay,
Absolutely.
And then the second question is, in Fairfield County, where the issue is affordability, would you expect people to stay in their units longer?
I can answer that. I can say one of the roles that Housing Development Fund plays is we help administer the City of Stamford's below market rent unit program. So that's this program that was created with this inclusionary zoning statute. So there's about 100 plus affordable units that were created as a result of developers having to set aside 10% of their units. And for a while, when developers were developing condos as opposed to rentals, which have now become more profitable, there's a large chunk of units that came on as these permanently deed restricted units. So those, getting back to your sort of affordability question, what we are seeing with those BMR units that were purchased probably in the early 2000s is folks are holding on to those units longer than typically what you see is 7 to 10 years for home buyers when they'll keep their units. So we're seeing some of these units that are now going on past 20 years. So folks do tend to hold on to them longer, because right in Stamford or Fairfield County, where else are you going to be able to purchase a unit that's affordable to you, because the prices have gone up so much already on top of the affordability crisis that it is a challenge. So yes, we do see folks, at least using that as an example, they do tend to hold those units longer than the traditional market owner. If that makes sense.
So this is related to the conversation about lending as a risk. Because I think the biggest risk would be the outcome of a foreclosure. So I'm just curious about how the land trust model accounts for or handles that aspect of that's kind of the greatest risk that I see is, if a homeowner stops paying or can't pay at all on their mortgage.
Good question.
Well, I don't have the numbers, but I know that it's a much smaller chance of foreclosure, because you've got your different layers of accountability and checking in, and you working together. It's like having a co-buyer. So we're going to want to make sure that the homeowner is successful, because we're literally financially invested, community invested. So we're going to be looking out for resources and checking in on a whole. I can't say from the banking perspective. Yes, yes.
Wouldn't and this, I'm asking you three as practitioners, I don't know the answer to this. Isn't there generally sometimes some sort of first right of refusal or some type of remedy that the land trust has if the property goes into foreclosure before the lender comes in to do the nasty, if you will?
Right. I don't know as a whole, but for us there would be. So we would be looking to acquire it prior to it going into foreclosure. It's to our benefit, yes.
Hi, my name is Alexander Kolokotronis. I'm director for the Naugatuck Valley Project, and we have a community land trust with 102 units of permanently affordable units with 6 limited equity housing co-ops, and we're very interested in replicating that model. I'm curious what barriers you believe exist in terms of public policy, and where legislative change, what kind of legislative changes maybe over the years there have been things that have occurred to you, things you're seeing right now, both at the local and state level.
I'm almost looking at you on that one, Chelsea.
Yeah,
One
I
of
don't
you
know. I'll jump in. I'm trying to put like the prior job brain in with the new job brain. I think, as with a lot of affordable housing models, financing is the key. And as I said before, there's not always the exact right financing models to match up with the different types of programs. And so you're always kind of picking financing programs that come with their own bells and whistles and requirements that are layered on top of your own requirements. And anyone who's developed affordable housing knows that whether it's the construction and then the affordability and other long-term requirements, that you're sort of packaging all these together. I think what is ideal is to see more housing, and I'm sure Patrick would agree with me on this, that's flexible and is easier to fit to different types of models and different types of needs. So example, having funding that doesn't necessarily have a deed restriction requirement but addresses North Hartford's housing quality issues but still maintains some of that rental housing, right? Or a financing stream that's more flexible that supports a land trust type model, which some of them would right now, but others would not. Or, but I think that's the key, right? Is acknowledging that while we have a small state, we have a lot of different marketplaces, a lot of different housing needs, and if we're going to have state funding or federal funding at that level needs to be more malleable to fit into these different types of models without a whole bunch of additional layering of requirements that makes it sort of untenable at the end of the day to work with. So I guess that's, and I think the SIF funding pool was sort of one attempt at that, right? Was an attempt to try to create a tool for housing and other types of community development that had fewer requirements. So that's one answer to that. But I think more types of housing finance that support a CLT model or are flexible in such a way that could support homeownership or different types of models like this would be ideal. But in terms of other policy changes, none are coming to mind immediately. You know, the type of model you're doing more single family can work in a land trust, right? And when you're using existing housing types, you're not dealing with the zoning issues, but that's another constant hurdle we're all aware of with multifamily development. So to the extent it's a land trust or any other type of multifamily development, creating better policy that allows for flexibility and creating different types of affordable models in places where the zoning otherwise wouldn't allow that is important.
There you go. You put that brain on. I was like, we got to talk about zoning. And then I think Jenny also talked about at the municipal level property taxes and sort of how individual communities are open to different models of housing. And so you change at the state level, but ultimately in community level, the friendliness for different housing models and different types of housing in the community and the municipalities' flexibility and willingness to provide abatements for different types of housing.
That is a financing stream in and of itself.
Absolutely. I think, interest of time, maybe one last question. I see a hand up and then we'll close. I think we promised to get you out of here on time.
Maybe we did, maybe me.
Hi, Nathan Carnes, Connecticut Department of Housing. I'd like to hear more about the financing of the trust, the long-term financing, the audits and whatever. I heard stewardship, I heard a nonprofit partner, but there's a difference between, yeah, we're in it for the next 3 years to make this work, and the long-term cost, in particular, property taxes, my tax bill has a value on my house and a value on my land. I'm going to assume that every town in Connecticut does that, but I don't know. And you're talking about friendly towns. Well, there's unfriendly towns. It may be that there are towns who are not willing to split the bill between the house to one entity and the land to another entity. And I'm assuming that the land trust would pay the property taxes on the land, but I don't know. So all of that, please.
So again, going to our regional community land trust, it actually depends on the community. When New London was forming its chapter and bringing the idea to the community, the consensus was that, well, New London, just so you know, it's very tax burdened in that we have the Coast Guard, Connecticut College, Mitchell College, and a ton of churches and nonprofits, and so therefore, our taxes are a little on the higher side for what the AMI is in the community, and so the consensus was that the community liked the idea of a community land trust, but did not want to go in an adversarial, here's another group that's not going to pay taxes. And so that in New London, the homeowners do pay taxes, pay full taxes as any other homeowner would. Yes, yes. But that's not the way that it's going to be in other communities.
I think that just goes to the issue of if you're planning for a land trust, again, it's going to look different from community to community, but that underlying land trust needs to be a actual board. It's theoretically, right, a board, as Jenee noted, this is made up of typically partners who own, but also other community members. And there needs to be, whether it's a nonprofit or other logistic supporting entity, creating an environment for that land trust group to continue. And also the financing necessary, whether it's for paying taxes, again, there has to be insurance on that entity, or other costs that just go along with maintaining that entity. So if that CLT entity is created just as a legal entity for that particular project, or whether maybe it's for multiple projects, there has to be sort of a long-term vision for what that land trust board or entity is going to look like and how it's going to be financed, so that you don't end up with this sort of ghost-like vacant CLT entity that's not resourced and not insured, and that could create more challenges, per Terry's comments, for resale later on with the lending environment. So I think it's important that that be a strong, well-grounded trust that's built with ideally another associated nonprofit or entity that can support it moving forward.
And I'm sorry, I know we're trying to get out of here, but we talked about equity sharing. The land trust does not share in the equity at resale, right? Maybe the share is between the equity embedded in the land and the trust and the home seller. But there's no cut of a resale that comes back to the trust, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But I've heard different ones created different ways, so I think it's important to note there's a lot of flexibility in the land trust models, and so some shared equity models create a shared upside of that, and some don't.
Yeah, and Jenny alluded to that, and I think probably we can have some examples from other locations that do that sort of split in equity. Okay, so we did that. Thank you so much to Terry and Kylie and Patrick and Myrna for giving us your expertise. Round of applause. And thank you all of you for taking time to be here with us in person. A plug for our next event is our annual Affordable Housing Conference, which is November 13th and 14th, coming up quickly in just a month. This year we have 26 amazing sessions spotlighting strategies and solutions that establish housing as the key to thriving communities. This is our 4th annual conference, and we have sessions like adding affordable housing to church buildings, lowering energy costs, going green, and building resilience using state and federal funding, parents leading in housing policy, a qualitative evaluation of the Connecticut Right to Counsel program, and that's just to name a few. We'll have a national policy roundtable, and we'll have a Connecticut legislative policy roundtable, and we're thrilled to announce that Majora Carter will be joining us as our keynote speaker this year. Majora is a champion for change in urban revitalization and sustainable development, and Myrna said you don't truly get out of the ghetto. We just, as a staff, finished reading her book that said you don't have to move to live in a better community, I think is the full title. So we hope you'll join us. You can register now on our website at pschousing.org. And thank you again for joining us. Grab some coffee or fruit on your way out, and let's continue to build a Connecticut where safe, affordable housing is a reality for everyone. Thank you so much.